Awesome. Steve, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you, Derek. Good morning. We're glad that everybody could join us today. This is the second webinar of our 2-webinar series. I think a number of you might have been on the one yesterday that our executive director, Patty Mamola, gave on rules and regulations, which was very informative. I have given this presentation several times already, not the 2-hour one, but for different organizations throughout the states, NSPE, Southern Nevada chapter, structural engineers, land surveyors. Those were all 1-hour presentations for their monthly meetings. I just recently gave a 2-hour presentation to the Western Federation of Land Surveyors at their annual conference held last month down in Las Vegas. So we are getting on the ethics bandwagon. I haven't been with the board a long time. I joined them last July as their investigator. And prior to that, I was in the engineering profession for 43 years. So I do have some experience. Some people may ask, well, how did you get involved in ethics? Well, as you can see from my registration at the bottom of the screen, I'm in Texas. I'm registered in Texas, and that's how I got started because they've had an ethics requirement for a number of years. And to be perfectly honest, when I first started going to them, they were very boring. There were usually a lawyer standing up there reciting chapter and verse of codes and laws for an hour, and you lost it after about 10 minutes. So I put together what I thought was a good presentation. I took it to the Texas PE board and said, will you approve it? They said no. Kind of looked at them and they said, it is the engineer's responsibility that if he feels it meets the requirements, he can count it. And basically in my research of different states, that's been the norm. They usually say it's the engineer's responsibility, but all boards have final say, just as Nevada does, as to whether it will be counted as a Pdh or not. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. Let's go ahead and get started here. We're probably going to go for about an hour and 40 minutes, leave the last 20 minutes open for questions and comments. And we do take all types of criticism or comments. Hopefully they're good. So first, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be discussing. Wait a minute, Derek, my screen just froze up. There we go.
There you go. Yeah.
What are we going to talk about in the next basically hour and 40 minutes? Well, understanding ethics, public perception. How does the public look at engineers? Ethics and education, this professional associations. I do apologize, but we will talk a little bit about the codes and then a number of case studies to see how different ethics situations and what the organizations think they were, or what their ethics violation was. So before that, I don't know if you've ever taken a look at the Nevada Connection or the website and know our board members. They're on the board. They have a 3-year term and it can be extended. So you might know some of these people. Michael Kidd, currently the board chairman, and then it has 8 more members. So a 9-member board. Along with the board, we don't have our pictures, but Patty Mamola, executive director, Jasmine Bailey, she takes care of the licensing and the licensing renewal. Murray Blaney, jack of all trades, operations and compliance, myself, and then Derek, who you had met earlier, he's our communications, and he also helps with any compliance issues that might come up. Oops, wrong way, I'm sorry. Now, I always start out first with a case study. This is one, if you'll notice the lower left-hand corner, this is from the NSPE. They have been documenting ethics cases since 1958. And we'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute, but I particularly like this one, and I'll explain why after you see the case study. And I call it Who Gets the Prize? basically, it could happen to anybody, any of you that's on this webinar. You go to a trade show, your employer, be it a municipality, an agency, a private consultant, pays for you attending the conference. You go down to the trade show and you throw your business card in the fishbowl and you win the door prize of $5,000 cash. Okay. The question being, is it ethical to keep it, or should you remit the prize to your employer? And if this was in person, we would have a little bit of discussion back and forth about what you think. I always like to ask people, does your company have a policy on receiving gifts or prizes? I know one company I worked for was limited to $200. Anything over 200, we had to report it. So I don't know if your company has that or not, but basically what the NSPE board said was that it has an ethical obligation to report the prize. The ultimate decision lays between the engineer and his employer or her employer. Now, I told this scenario at the very first ethics presentation I gave back in 2013. And after I told this, or we talked about it, this engineer in the second row raised his hand and said, that happened to me. I won $5,000. And I looked at him and I said, well, what did you do? He said, answer is pretty simple. I own the company. So he kept the money. But anyway, it can happen. And it would be I would be interested to hear what some of the your companies have with regards to prizes and things of that nature. Now, have you given into any thought as to actually what is ethics? Well, if you look up the basic definition, it's just the discipline dealing with what is good and bad, or doing what is right at the right time. Now, along with that, I always like to ask the question, where did the word come from? The word ethic. I would say, again, if this was live, we would be talking about it and people would be giving their answers. But the word ethic is actually from the Greek word ethikos, meaning habit or custom. And that kind of turned into a good set of habits or customs, or ethics. Now, there are ethics definitions for every profession out there. Business, they have their specific definition. You look at any other profession and you could probably find an ethics definition for them. Take medical, for example. We always talk about medical ethics, and that is an area of much discussion between a lot of people. Now, I did look for one for legal, but I couldn't find it. I did actually find one, but it's very basic, to be honest, compared to what I found for other professions. So yes, lawyers do have an ethical code. Engineering, there are multiple ones out there, but I looked at a number of them, and this kind of hits all the key areas. So they may sound a little bit different, use different words, but if you break them down, they're all basically saying the same thing about doing what is right. And then along with engineering, we have surveying. And that falls along the same lines as all the other ethics definitions.
Hey, Steve, before you go on, I got a request from somebody that said they couldn't see you. Do you want to share your video? I think it'll just give you, you'll be able to see your face.
Oh, they want to see who they're talking
Well,
about.
sometimes it's helpful I just asked to share your video, so you should be good.
Well, it's sharing now. Am I there?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I can't do anything rude, crude, and socially unacceptable, right?
Just keep going.
Okay, sounds good. So along with this new requirement from 2021 for the state, where we have to get 2 PDHs in ethics, for those of you who are have multiple license in other states. Have you ever looked at how many states require an ethics PDH to maintain your license? Any guesses? Anybody want to throw something up in the chat room? Is it 5? Is it 50? 20? Do we have anybody putting anything in there? Actually, the number, it's freezing up again, is 15. That's as of March of 2022. What's interesting is when I started doing this in 2013, there were only 6 states that required an ethics PDH for professional engineers. The states highlighted in yellow require an ethics PDH. And the states in dark blue, which is very interesting, they don't require any PDHs once you get your license. So once you get your license in those states, there's no continuing education requirement that you have to maintain or meet to maintain your license. I thought that was very interesting. But along with engineers, the other part of our association are land surveyors. So for the PEs out there who are land surveyors, how many states do you think require an ethics PDH to maintain your PLS? Would it be the same or would it be different? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. It's 15, but it's not all the same states, which is kind of interesting. I was a little surprised at that. I did went through and looked at them, and take Florida. You're required to get one for your PE, but not for your PLS. Same thing with Nebraska, New Jersey. You don't need one for your surveyor's license, but you do for your PE. And then on the flip side of that, West Virginia, South Dakota, and Illinois require them for land surveyors, but not for PEs. So again, I thought that was kind of interesting. We will be doing these ethics presentations on an ongoing basis. And what I usually do with these presentations is I update them annually. So I will take a look at every state every year and see which ones have added ethics for both professional engineers and land surveyors. And like I said, since 2013, it's been growing very rapidly. Now, we talk about PDHs and what some people say are CEUs, Professional Development Hour and Continuing Education Units. But anybody know the definition of a PDH? Is it actually 60 minutes? Is it more or is it less? Actually, a PDH is 50 minutes of instruction. They call it the contact hour. So you're allowed technically 10 minutes for breaks during the hour. Now, what about a CEU? A lot of people use them interchangeably, but that's not correct. The actual definition of a CEU is 10 contact hours of instruction. So basically, one CEU, 10 PDHs. So they are not really, cannot be used interchangeably. Now, what counts? What is the definition of what you must do to obtain a PDH? Well, basically, an activity that is technical in nature and pertains to the engineer's license. So that is a broad range of a pretty big spectrum of things you have to do. And if you look at a number of states, you will see that they usually say something similar to they must be technical, ethical, or managerial in content. Or if it benefits you in your job responsibilities, most states will allow you to count it as a PDH. And what do we say? As part of our codes, the definition for the state, an activity to maintain, improve, or expand the skills and knowledge relevant to his or her discipline. Now, what's required in Nevada? Basically, as Patty went over yesterday, for those of you who attended her webinar, of course, it's been here for a while, 30 PDHs for the biennial renewal period. Added in April of 2021, 2 hours in professional ethics. And also added in April of 2021, 1 hour of provisions of the 625 NRS NNAC provisions. You may carry forward 15, but ethics and study of the laws and regulations may not be carried forward. You must get those 3 Pdhs every renewal period. And what counts? Kind of again, basically college credits, you get the whole 30 right there if you go back to school. If you're on the quarter system, you get 30. If you teach a webinar, like I'm doing now, I can count this double, which is a little different. And I get back to people who have multiple state licenses. The presenter in other states does not get to count double in certain states. But what they do get to count, like in Texas, it's just 1 for 1. I get to count the preparation time for the presentation. The presenter in certain states can count the prep time for his presentation as a Pdh, but not in Nevada. Authoring a paper or a book gets you 10. Attendance is 1, like this. Participating in professional or technical organizations, 2 per year per organization. Receiving a patent is 10. And just added in April of 2021, self-study, 1 per hour of self-study. And it was asked yesterday during Patty's presentation, can you do 30 hours of self-study? The answer is yes, but it would be better if you had various other Pdhs besides just self-study. Because the final determination of whether it counts as a Pdh or not lies with the board. Teaching the same course can only be counted once. Like I said, I've given this presentation maybe 4 times this year, and it only counts as 1 or 2 Pdhs, depending upon whether it's 1 hour or 2 hours. And this one is an interesting one. Full-time educator may not obtain credit for teaching, even if it's a professional engineering course. Now, how do you think the general public looks at engineers with regards to honesty and ethics? What do you think the public perception or the public opinion is with regards to the engineering profession? Are we rated very highly by the public, or do they kind of look down on us? It's kind of an interesting question. Well, if you look at various studies, one that was not recently done, was a couple years ago by McKinney's advisors. What they did is they asked the general public, what are the first 3 words that come to your mind when you think of engineers? And what they did is they took the number of responses for each word, and the more responses they got or received, the larger the font in the word. So you can see the general public looks at engineers as smart, technical, educated, intelligent, professional. Well, the one that's kind of hard to see, but I kind of like, there were a number of people thought we were nerdy. I'll take it. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting way to show survey results. Now, the other survey I looked at, and everybody's heard of the Gallup Polls. Well, they survey the general public's perception of multiple professions every year. And they do professional engineers. Now, it's not every year that they survey engineers, but they've been doing engineers since 1976. But back in 83 and 91, they only rated us, 45% rated us highly with regards to honesty, or high to very high regarding honesty and ethics. So I sometimes ask, what happened back in 83 and 91? Was there a major catastrophe or disaster that people blamed engineers for? I'm not sure. I really haven't come up with an answer for that, but a very low rating back at that time period. I'm happy to say that we're doing much better now. In fact, I always like to pose the question, what do you think the top 5 professions are with regards to honesty and ethics that the general public rate the highest? Now, the #1 rated profession with regards to honesty and ethics has been #1 for the past 18 years. Nobody comes close to matching them. And you can probably guess, because there's usually always somebody in the audience who gets this right. Nurses. Last year, they had an 89% rating. Second, doctors. Third, believe it or not, grade school teachers for last year. Pharmacists, believe it or not, police officers. Now, the one that gets the most people, gets people excited the most about is when I ask them, what do you think's at the bottom of the list? The 5 worst rated professions, or what the general public thinks are the lowest with regards to honesty and ethics. And there's a new winner for this year, or for last year, I should say. Well, the bottom 5, according to the results of last year, were lawyers, 21%, business executives, 17%, advertising practitioner, 10%, car sales, 8%. They used to be at the bottom all the time, but there's a new low with regards to how the general public thinks of this profession. Members of Congress, 8%. Now, if you're interested in how engineers do, the last time that we were surveyed was in 2019, and we were #2 at 66%. And what was interesting to see that year, we were the only non-medical profession that the general public rated very highly in the top 5 ratings for honesty and ethics, which I think is a pretty good showing. Now, if you're interested, these are the results since 1976. The highest rating we ever had, I believe, was in 2012. I've got a bar over that part of my screen. So I think it's 2012, we had a rating of 70%. So you can see for the past number of years, we have been thought of very highly by the general public. Now, what about ethics and technical education? Do you think our schools and colleges and universities are doing a good job in educating the young engineers in ethical values and what they need to consider when they enter the profession? Well, if you look at it, and if you go back to Abbott, which is the accreditation board, they have approved new criteria, and they've put a heightened role on ethics with regards to how it's studied, how it's implemented, and how it's included in course curriculums to maintain their accreditation. And what they're looking for is for schools and universities to basically teach what they call ethical awareness and considerations in engineering. And the way they want you to do that, or that they accept, is looking at it by mandatory ethics classes, electives, or even just including ethics discussions in standard course curriculums. So they're putting a very high value on educating our young engineers with regards to ethics. So let me ask you, what do you think the top 3 engineering schools were in Nevada last year? Two of them, I'm pretty sure you're already thinking about right now. And they've been the top two every year that I've looked for the past 5 years, I think it is. And that would be, in no particular order, UNR and UNLV. Those are always the top two. They switch positions back and forth, but you could basically say that they're equal. The third position is the one that changes, seems to change from year to year. And back last year, it was College of Southern Nevada, had the third place ranking. Now, granted, you could find various studies that say different schools and everything, but I looked at several, and these were the three that I came up with. Now, if we go national, what do you think the top three engineering schools are in the nation? Excuse me. Now, again, just like in Nevada, the top two have stayed the same year after year. It's the third place position that changes on an annual basis. And of course, the number one rated school, MIT. Number two every year has been Stanford. And the third place, just like in this state, changes from year to year, UC Berkeley. So kind of interesting. Again, the surveys vary. What I did is looked about 4 or 5 different ones, added up how many times the same schools appeared on all the surveys, and that's how I came up with my my picks. Now, what about UNR? Well, they address it in the College of Engineering in their course or student objectives, and one of those being ethical and professional responsibility. One of the objectives of the engineering college. You can actually get a Bachelor of Arts in philosophy that focuses on ethics. You can minor in ethics, law, and politics, or you can also obtain a graduate certificate in ethics, law, and politics. So they consider it a very important subject. In UNLV, they address it through their learning outcomes or student learning outcomes and addressing, recognizing ethical and professional responsibilities. Now, if you look at some of the courses at UNLV, they have a variety of ethics courses that you can take. Now, UNR has even more ethics courses listed than UNLV, but what's unique about UNLV, they actually have one in the engineering curriculum, ethics and professional practice of engineering. UNR has more courses, but they don't have one listed in the College of Engineering. But philosophy tends to be the area when you find the most ethics courses. What about education for surveyors? They're part of our group too. And actually, in this state, there's only one school you probably know about, Great Basin College up in Elko. You can get a Bachelor of Applied Science in land surveying and geomatics. We are working, or they are working, I should say, to expand. And the board is working with UNR on a possible surveying curriculum. So it's something that they're looking for, and it just takes a lot of work to get that approved and in place. Unlike engineering, there are only about 136 schools across the country that have surveying courses where you can get a degree, being an associate's or a bachelor degree in surveying. If you go outside the state, take the Virginia Military Institute. I put this one in because that's one of the, or that's where I went to school, VMI. We have, instead of student handbooks and outcomes, we have, since it's a military-based school, general orders. General order number 46 is the ethics code, and it is updated on an annual basis. It's basically based off of honor, integrity, accountability, and respect. Now, if we were live and everything, I would do what they call the 20 seconds of silence until somebody makes a comment, particularly about the two pictures on the right-hand side. And no, I am not that old. I did not graduate in 1943. That's my father. I graduated in 1976. So if you're looking at your computer screens, you might recognize me now. But I actually should put a picture of my nephew up there because he graduated in the class of 2007. We make it a family affair. So let me ask you, this is a case study about obligation of engineering faculty member who became aware of cheating. So what happened was a professor, or you're a professor, you're a professional engineer, and you're told by one of your students that during an exam in another professor's class who's also a PE, that the student witnessed another student using a phone to photograph the test questions. The student reported this to the class professor, but he felt, or she felt, that proper action wasn't taken, so they come to you. Now, knowing this, what are your ethical obligations under these circumstances for the way you understand your code of ethics? Actually, what the NSPE said, you have an ethical obligation to approach the other professor and verify the allegations and whether appropriate actions were taken. If not, take it to the next step and follow the university's due process regarding such matters. So it can even happen in education. Now, how are ethics addressed in some of our national associations in engineering? Well, the NSPE, if any of you are members, I kind of say they set the bar with regards to engineering ethics. The first ethics code was actually adopted in 1946, and it was revised, the last revision, in 2019. They have very extensive information regarding ethics on their websites, or website, I should say. The timeline basically is the first code, the rules. Then they wrote the current NSPE Code of Ethics. And like I said earlier, or just a few seconds ago, revised in 2019. Now, within the Engineer's Creed, which starts their ethics section, they make a statement about advancement and betterment of the public health, safety, and welfare. I want you to remember that, because what you will see as we go forward is that's in almost every ethics policy you find with regards to engineering. They want you to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And it's mentioned several times throughout the NSPE code. They have a preamble, they have fundamental canons, they have rules of practice, and they have professional obligations, all for ethics. In the preamble, they talk about public health, safety, and welfare, and ethical conduct. In the fundamental canons, the very first one, hold paramount safety, health, and welfare of the public. Rules of practice, same thing. Professional obligations, same thing. Safety, health, and well-being or welfare of their community or the public. Now, I mentioned they have been reviewing ethics cases since 1958, and they have what they call the BER, Board of Ethical Review. That is made up, or it was established in 1954. It's 7 licensed members appointed by the president, and they meet twice a year to discuss ethics issues and give their opinions on any ethics cases that might be presented to the NSPE. And like I had mentioned earlier, if you're a member, you can go on the website, the members only site, and review any of the cases that they've reviewed since 1958. Makes for some interesting reading sometimes. They also do something else on their website, which they call State Watch. And what they do is they track legislation in all 50 states and see if any of it could affect professional engineers. One recent one, this was about 2017 in Nevada, where there was legislation that wanted to reduce or make less restrictive licensing of multiple professions. Professional engineers weren't specifically targeted, but they were included in this legislation. Where we think we should be tough on registration, they wanted to weaken it. But working with the NSPE, it was basically killed. So we did not have to weaken or lessen the restrictions for licensing for professional engineers. Another one that has made the rounds, Texas, Oklahoma, a number of different states. This is not with regards to ethics, but look what it says they were looking at doing. If you were working on state contracts, they wanted to put tracking software on your computer so that they could track the amount of time you spent on the state contract, where they would record your keystrokes and take a screenshot of your screen every 3 minutes. But so far, I don't know of any state that has passed that, even though it's been proposed in a number of them. Now, what about the ASCE, second professional organization for engineers? Well, actually their code, ethics code, was adopted in 1914 and recently updated in 2020. And we're going to talk in a minute about this recent update because it is a major change to the way ASCE looks at and addresses ethics. The previous code was based on what they call the canon model. And you're probably read through it or familiar with it. The ethical guidelines were addressed by 8 different canons, okay? The new model is addressed by what they call a stakeholder model. And this was adopted in October 28th of 2020. Now, what this does is it makes the code structure more intuitive, and this is verbatim from the ASCE website, to the engineer seeking to resolve ethical concerns. Now, if you compare the different stakeholders model to the canon model, they basically address the same issues, but there are only 5 stakeholder models as compared to 8 different canons in the previous ethics code. And these being society, natural and built environment, profession, clients and employers, and peers. Now, these are also listed the way the ASCE looks at them with regards to importance. So number 1 would be society. And basically what they address in that, again, excuse me, got ahead of myself. Just like NSPE, ASCE, health, safety, and welfare of the public. And this is further their code of ethics that you will see on the website. But as I was saying about society, the very first part of that stakeholder model, first and foremost, protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, along with, in the society model, again, health, safety, and welfare of the public. Natural and built environment basically has to do with sustainability. Adhere to the principles of sustainable development, mitigate the effects, use resources wisely. And these are just several, I think there are 5 bullet points under this particular stakeholder model. Profession, uphold the honor, integrity, and dignity. Reject unfair competition. and continue your professional development. And there are a few others if you want to take a look at them on the website. Clients and employers, faithful agent, that was a canon. If there are going to be consequences to them not following your recommendations, you need to make them aware of that. And again, bringing up the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And finally, peers and what you should do and ethical behavior. So again, addressed in very great detail, both by the NSPE and the ASCE. And along with the NSPE having a board of ethical review, the ASCE has what they call the CPC, or the Committee on Professional Conduct, which reviews cases sent in under the ASCE Code of Ethics. And just so you know, if something is sent in that happened before the new stakeholder model was implemented, they would go back to the old canon model code to address that particular issue. The committee consists of the chair, who is the ASCE president, staff contact, who is usually their legal counsel, and then 11 ASCE members makes up the committee. Now, what about the NSPS, the Surveyors Association? They also have a very specific and detailed ethics code. When I first was going to do my first land surveyor ethics presentation, I found this picture and I wanted to ask them the question, what the heck is that guy doing? And they basically told me nothing. It's just posed for, somebody taking a picture, thought it would be funny. You would not get me standing out on that ledge. I do not play well with heights, but I thought it was kind of an interesting picture. The objective, if you look at the NSPS side, if you have your PLS, encourage high standards of ethical and professional behavior. Along with that, they have a canon model of ethics, and they have 8 different canons to address those needs. Or 7, I believe. Excuse me, 7. Now, what about state associations? We looked at national, and now there are also state associations that address ethics. So it's everywhere. The NALS, Land Surveyors Association, and in their mission or purpose, promote and maintain the highest possible standard of professional ethics. The NSPE Nevada chapter, again, promote the ethical and competent practice of engineering, along with several other points. And the Nevada board, I kind of look at that as a state association also. What they say, and again, verbatim, safeguard life, health, and property, and to promote the public welfare. Health, safety, and welfare of the general public, as I've mentioned in all these other codes. Might be said slightly differently, but it's all saying the same thing. The mission and purpose, or purpose and mission, again, talking about several different things. Now, this should be a pretty easy question for you, since you've seen it several times since we've started this webinar. But what are the 2 statutes that address engineers or surveyors' conduct? Again, pretty simple answer. What we term NAC, the Nevada Administrative Code, or the Nevada Revised Statutes. Both of them referenced as Chapter 625. One is NRS and one is NAC. Now, the purpose in the statutes, it actually states again, safeguard life, health, and property, and to promote the public welfare, as I mentioned earlier. Fundamental principle, maintain high standards of ethical conduct. more fundamental principles. And again, we're not going to take the time to go through and read every one of them, but it strives to tell you how or what kind of code of conduct you should maintain as a professional engineer or professional land surveyor. It addresses relations with the public. And again, looking out for the safety.
You wanna listen to this guy?
Excuse me? Okay, so I'm sorry.
Sorry,
Safety.
can just a reminder, everybody, please keep your mics muted while during the presentation. We'll open it up to questions at the end of the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Derek. Again, as I said before, safety, health, and welfare of the public. Relations with the public again. Still some more points. All of these can be found in the recent codes, recent printings of the codes. Relations with their employees and clients. As I was saying that, it made me think of a point that was made in the webinar yesterday that you need to be aware of. There are a lot of new revisions to both the NAC and our NRC codes. And if you look at the title, I put in parentheses when the most recent revision was made. Now, if you go to the state law library, you will not find these revisions published yet. We are working to get them to update their standards and codes, but they're usually a couple years behind. But you can go to one place and find the most recent version of every code that addresses professional land surveyors and professional engineers, and that's the board website. We keep it up to date on a not even better than an annual basis. So if you want to go to one place to find the most recent version, the most up-to-date versions, go to the board's website and they will be there. Employers and clients. Again, just about every area that you interact, there's a reference to a statute or a code. And working in your areas of expertise. And there are a number of different parts to each one of these codes. Both with the public, with your clients, and also with other engineers. This specifically addressed. Now, this is one that I wish every state would incorporate, and that is requiring a contract be written between the engineer and his client or her client. That prevents a lot of errors or misunderstandings. We see a number of complaints that address contracts. So it's very good, but it's also very important that you be aware of everything that needs to be included in the contract. And that is the scope of work, cost for completion of the work, and an estimated date for completion of the work. There's one other, it's not required that you have, but that you just acknowledge whether you have it or not. And that's disclosing whether or not you have professional liability insurance. Like I said, it's not required that you have it, but it is now required that you let them know whether you do or do not. But again, the three provisions: scope, cost, and completion date. And that solves a multitude or prevents a multitude of potential errors from happening. Now, Another important area, and this causes or has subjected to some people to some discipline by the board, and that is the area of what we call principle of responsible charge. And if you look at the two codes, in the NAC code, it is referenced 16 times. And in the NRS code, it's referenced 9 times. So I always like to ask before we get into it, what is your definition of responsible charge? And again, if this was live, we would be discussing it before we show what the definitions are. Now, if you look at the NSPE, they don't specifically reference responsible charge, but what they're talking about is when you affix your signature or seal to plans or documents, you are taking responsibility for everything that's on those plans or in those documents. And what I also did is I went and looked at a couple of other states. Like for the Florida Board of Professional Engineers, they have a definition for responsible charge. And they say, as it states, degree of control that an engineer is required to maintain over the decisions made personally or by others under your supervisory direction, but it makes you responsible for everything that is done. Utah basically says the same thing, makes the engineer in responsible charge responsible for everything on that project. How does the state define it? Basically, it's important enough to read: the independent control and direction by the use of intuitive skill and independent judgment of the investigation or design of professional engineering or land surveying work, or the supervision of such work, is how the state defines responsible charge. Now, there was a recent change in the code that prior to this change, if you had multiple offices, you were required to have a PE in responsible charge physically located at that facility. But that has changed. You can have one engineer in responsible charge of multiple locations. He no longer, or she no longer, has to be on site, physically on site, to be considered in responsible charge. It also has a lot to do with signing and sealing. And if you look at the various codes, you can read through how they define responsible charge with regarding your signature and your seal. They also address, if you stamp work prepared by another engineer, you are basically taking, as we've talked about before, full responsibility for what that other engineer did. Now, it also says that you could be sanctioned if that engineer working for you makes a mistake, along with the engineer who made the mistake, if it's serious enough, can also be sanctioned along with the person in responsible charge. I've had questions asked before about what happens when a complaint is filed against a professional engineer or land surveyor. Well, we have a very strict policy that we follow, and it's part of the code, NAC 625-640. And it's the procedure that's followed if a complaint is filed. And basically, it says that any person can file a complaint to the board. It doesn't mean that an official case will be opened, but it will be looked at and addressed by the board. Upon the receipt of the complaint, usually myself or Derek or Murray will take the complaint and start an investigation. And then upon completion, we are required to file a report to the board executive director, Patty Mamola. She then will take a look at our report along with a, what we term a board liaison. A board member will be assigned to the case. And if it's a major or serious enough case, the entire board might be assigned to it. But normally it's just the executive director and the board liaison will then review our case summary and see where the case should be taken. They will decide whether to dismiss this complaint. They will then, if they feel that it should move forward, try to negotiate a settlement with the respondent or the complaint, or the respondent. And then if the board approves, they will put the negotiated settlement into effect. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. If they can't come to an agreement with the respondent, then there's the next course of action to actually schedule a disciplinary hearing. And that goes before the full board. So we do have a very strict policy or procedure that has to be followed whenever a complaint is filed, be it by another engineer, by the general public, or whatever. So what are some of the disciplinary actions or sanctions that the state has found necessary to impose on engineers within the state? Well, one, practicing with an expired license. What the sanction involved, it was found that he was guilty or she was guilty, and it involved reimbursement to the state for the legal fees, because along with being reviewed by the executive director, board liaison, and the board, it goes before the board's legal counsel also for a legal review. The engineer was required to notify each client that he worked for or performed during the time period that his license was expired, and provide and pay all costs associated with bringing improper stamped plans into compliance. Here comes that working without a contract. Even though it is in the code, as we just talked about, it's not always enforced or provided by the engineer, because I don't know if the general public knows that there's supposed to be a contract. It's up to the engineer, I feel, to be sure that his client or her client is aware of the need to have a signed contract by both parties. It was determined that the engineer was at fault, and the following sanction was imposed: suspension of his license for 2 years, with the suspension stayed and probation imposed. While on probation, the engineer is required to submit bi-monthly probation reports of all work completed in the state with copies of the contracts. In this particular case, had to pay a legal fee of $1,750 and issue partial refund of the fees to the complainant of just over $3,800. So it can get costly. Now, for those of you who have dual licenses or multiple licenses, I actually met an engineer one time. He had 35 different Pdhs. That had to be a nightmare trying to keep all of those straight. But if you are sanctioned by another state, it's required that you inform this board of that sanction, and then that will be reviewed and to see if necessary disciplinary action needs to be taken within this state. This case, the other state found the engineer negligent, incompetence, unlicensed practice of land surveying, unlawful use of the term structural engineer, no written contract, and unprofessional conduct. So some pretty major violations there. And the sanction imposed by the other state was pretty severe. His license was revoked, but it was stayed, and 3 years probation pay investigation fees of $10,500, had to pass the state law and board rules exam again, complete an approved ethics course. And this was a state that didn't acquire an ethics Pdh, but they still required the engineer to take an ethics course. And to complete 2 college level board approved engineering courses. Now, because he or she was also licensed in Nevada, it was felt that those penalties or his violations were severe enough, and they violated our code as well. So his license was revoked, but again, stayed pending completion of a 3-year probation. And again, submit bi-monthly reports of all state engineering work, plus copies of all the contracts. Now, this was a more severe one than the very first one we talked about. An engineer was actually found to have been working for 10 years with an expired license. He did admit that he was falsifying the dates on his license and on the stamp and on all the submittals and plans and documents that he prepared. The sanctions after the investigation was finalized involved, even though his license has expired, he was licensed in other states, and he was found to be in good standing in those other states. Also, the work that he did in those 10 years was reviewed, and it was found to be in compliance with codes and specifications. So his license was reinstated, but immediately suspended for 10 years. Suspension stayed and probation imposed for another 10 years. Paid legal and administrative costs of over $2,300. Pay an administrative fine of $15,000. And then pay a $200 fine for each of the 37 projects stamped while his license was expired. And then pay all costs associated with reviewing and restamping the aforementioned projects. So as you can see, the sanctions can be fairly substantial depending upon the violation. And then again, as with the other one, complete an advanced level ethics course. And this one was specifically mentioned as Texas Tech University at the Murdahl Center for Engineering Professionalism. Texas Tech happens to have multiple levels of ethics courses that they provide. So why don't we finish up with a few case studies? And these were taken from the National Society of Professional Engineers, the BER cases that were reviewed. And again, like I said, I always like to do these in person so we can talk about them before you see how the board ruled, to see if your thinking was in line with what they did. So first one being use of a drone. These are becoming more and more prevalent. I don't think they're used as much by professional engineers as they are by land surveyors, which I believe it's a godsend to those people. But the case here was that you're an engineer and you're contracted by a DOT to perform structural inspections of bridges, and you're using a drone to record those structural inspections. During the recording of the inspection, you record gunfire between a law officer and a motorist. As required, you inform the DOT of this. And in this particular states, I was a little surprised at this. They say they're not planning to share the information with the law enforcement authorities unless requested to do so. But how would the law enforcement know that there's evidence if the DOT doesn't tell them? how would you, or what would you think that the BER said or ruled in this particular situation? Did he do the right thing, or should he have done more? Well, what they decided was they felt he met his ethical obligation by informing the DOT, but they also stated in their ruling, but since this was a significant concern to the public health and safety, they might as well have said welfare too, the engineer should inform law enforcement and then also inform the DOT that he was taking these particular actions. So let me ask you a couple of questions about drones. How many of you use them for engineering or surveying? I know it's kind of hard to answer that question since it's hard to see if anybody's raising their hands or not. But if you do use one, are you licensed? Because I have a drone. It's just a play toy. I have one that's called a Mavic Mini 2. And since it weighs less than half a pound, you do not have to be licensed. But I plan to get my license anyway, because even if it's a light enough drone that you don't have to be licensed, if you use it as part of your profession, regardless of the weight or classification of the drone, you are required to be licensed. So it's best to go ahead and get your license. I don't think the course takes very long, but the approval process, I believe, can take several months to actually obtain your license. So for the land surveyors out there, and this is a very interesting question, when is a drone operator performing land surveying? Can you fathom a guess? What does the drone operator have to be doing to be considered performing professional land surveying as defined in the code? Well, what it says is when the operator creates a topographical survey or overlays a boundary on the rectified photo and provides the finished product to a private client or public agency, the operator must be authorized by law to perform land surveying. Now, it also does those state, and it gets back to responsible charge. If you look at the bottom, that a drone operator who is not a professional land surveyor may perform land surveying if the work is performed under the responsible charge of a licensed professional land surveyor. So again, it comes up with the concept of responsible charge. Now, what is the board doing to help with this issue of people just getting a drone, going out and thinking they can do surveying or other such things? Well, one is education. And this can be found in the newsletters about 2 years ago. And it talks about the education that the board can provide to help with this issue, and also through enforcement. And that's basically say, if you see somebody that's not a professional surveyor doing land surveying with a drone, just to report them. Now, there was a tragic case about a year ago over in California involving a drone, and it was the illegal use of a drone. And what happened was, in a protected sanctuary in Southern California, it was a nesting area for terns, and a drone was being flown illegally over the nesting area, and it crashed. And basically what happened was the birds were scared. So they all abandoned their nests and they never came back. So as it said in the article, when they should have been hatching, they all died because somebody was flying a drone over an area they weren't supposed to be, crashed and scared off all the birds, and their nests were abandoned. So a pretty tragic event. Have any of you ever been subpoenaed by the grand jury? I've served on juries, but I've never been involved with the grand jury. I hope I never have to, and I hope none of you ever have to either. But this case study has to do with that type of situation. You're an engineer and you work for a client. All the work is completed. Several months later, you're contacted you're issued a subpoena by a grand jury regarding criminal investigation into your client or former client. You comply and supply all the information they want, but you're never called to testify, and you never receive any further information from the grand jury. So the question is, do you have an ethical obligation to inform your client regarding submission of documents pertaining to work you did for him with the grand jury? Remember, one aspect of the ethics code is to be a faithful agent to your client. But would that come into play under this situation? What do you think the board ruled with regards to what the engineer should do? Well, what they said was no, this is a criminal matter. Advising your client could compromise the investigation and expose you to prosecution. So they said it was best that the engineer consult with legal counsel concerning that issue. Here's something that might happen to any of us. And this was a case where an employee refused to return copies of work to his previous firm. He'd been employed with the firm, he'd been stamping and sealing drawings for the firm, but when he left, he took the work with him. And he claimed that they were his personal records and he needed them for personal and professional liability. So when he leaves, like I said, the firm demands the return of the copies, claiming they are proprietary work product. He refuses, saying he has a right to copies of his own work. Was it ethical to refuse to return the copies of the work to the firm? Well, what the outcome was, it was unethical for him to refuse to return the copies, according to the Board of Ethical Review. And he should have discussed it, negotiated, and what they also said in their ruling, negotiate terms and conditions of his departure. They did feel the firm has proprietary rights and interests that should have been respected by the employee. Along a similar note is employment or denying employment verification. Okay. After 12 years, an engineer leaves the firm to work for another firm. The engineer that left later asked the former firm for employment verification for a license application. The firm refuses based on, one, the engineer left with no advance notice. Basically, he walked in, said, "I'm quitting," and walked out the door. He promised to follow up on several points, but he never did. And they felt that he owed them the courtesy of giving some notice about prior to his departure. So, were the actions of the engineer and the firm ethical? The way the engineer left and the firm refusing to give employment verification. What they ruled was that it was unethical for the engineer to fail to provide timely and sufficient notice. That's a common courtesy. And it was unethical for the firm to withhold the employment verification. Because he wasn't asking for a reference or anything, it was just verifying his employment from date A to date B. Now, I always like to ask various questions. As you can see on there, this has nothing to do with ethics. So, anybody see any problem with that picture on the right-hand side? And actually, that is a flag that's on the ship. And yes, there is another flag flying above the United States flag. And everybody immediately says that is incorrect. You should never have another flag flying above the US flag. And that is correct. As is stated in the United States Code, no other flag or pennant should be placed above or if on the same level to the right of the flag of the United States of America. But there is an exception to that rule. And that is, believe it or not, except during a church service conducted by a naval chaplain at sea, when the church pennant may be flown above the flag during the service for the personnel of the Navy. So there is an exception. I didn't know this. I can't remember where I found this or how I found it, but I'm kind of a trivia nut and I kind of like to dig into these things a little bit. But keeping along a military theme, one last case study to take a look at, and that is ethical obligations of the military as a professional engineer. So the situation is, you're an engineer, professional PE in the private sector, but you're also a member of the reserves and you are mobilized. As a reserve officer, your duties will be as an engineer, and you are expected to use your civilian engineering skills in the performance of your military duties. So, as being called up to active duty as a reserve officer, you fall under the, or are subjected to, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which exempts you from civil liability. But this particular engineer feels that his professional or her professional and ethical obligations under the Civilian Ethics Code of Professional Engineering still apply. The question, does the engineer still have ethical obligations under the Code of Ethics as a professional engineer while serving as a member of the U.S. military who falls under the Uniform Code of Military Justice? They actually ruled, for practical matters, the Uniform Code of Military Justice controls. But I use this in every presentation, ethics presentation I give, and the majority of the military people who have served say they still feel an obligation under the Civilian Code of Ethics to do what is right and follow the civilian code, even though they would not be subjected to any civil liability. So that basically brings us to a conclusion of what I had to prepare. We're finishing just a little bit early, so we have plenty of time for questions because we did not have the ability to discuss, like I would have liked to, a number of these issues and cases to get your opinions before we saw what the actual rulings were. Because I'm always like to hear how people see some of these scenarios and how they would play out if they were involved. But to finalize, I always like to say that doing the right thing doesn't automatically bring success, but compromising ethics almost always leads to failure or potentially major problems. So that brings us to a conclusion of the formal part of the presentation. I guess, Derek, I need to turn it over to you to how we're going to handle the questions and
Yep.
The certificate and those matters.
Absolutely. So leave that screen up for a second, Steve. So everyone, I've been doing my best to follow along on the chat thread. It's with 500 people. It's it's a little, for one guy, it's hard to type and click and maintain make sure that the Zoom is proceeding. Anyway, apologies for that. I'm not a Zoom expert, so I'm doing what I can. Good questions though. All in all, I think a lot of you had some very good questions and some comments. So I think the best way to do it, I have some instructions up there to raise your hand rather than using your unmuting and stuff, just because it's going to take me a long time to scroll down to see all the hands that are raised and be able to click you and so forth. What we did yesterday is just type your questions in the chat. I'll do my best to sort of go through them as they roll in. I can scroll to the top. I think some of you had questions early before we started. I told you to sort of hold on to those until we get to this point. If you don't mind, I'll just ask you to repeat those questions. Sorry to have you do that, but again, the chat thread is getting a little congested. So with that, I'm going to, and just to clear up a couple questions I think several of you have, is how do you document this webinar? The next slide is going to be a certificate. That's it right there. So what we did yesterday is I gave instructions for people to just do a screen capture of this slide. And in order to do a screen capture, specifically, there's a couple ways you can do it. If you're on a Mac, I imagine there's a few of you are on Mac, hold your Shift key, Command key, and the number 3, and then it'll let you click on it to save it. If you're on a PC, it's just Shift, then the Windows key, and the S key, and that gets you to the snippet file. Anyway, you can take a screen grab of this screen right here to accomplish that. Save it, document it. It's got the information on it. It tells you exactly what it is. You do not need to send this in to us. This is strictly for your record keeping purposes. You can keep it as a PDF, JPEG, whatever, make your own notations. You can print it out, put it in a folder, whatever your method of documenting your PDHs is, just do that. If you have trouble doing that for any reason, send me an email. My email was on the previous slide. And just say, hey, send me a certificate of completion. I'll email you a PDF of that so you can use it for documentation. So those are the instructions for that. As far as questions go, we'll just kind of roll through it, Steve, and I'll read them as best I can.
Okay.
I'm going to start at the bottom just so I cover the most recent ones. There is another requirement in the CMU that would require compliance with the Code of Ethics. Sorry, I'm not sure what that's referring to. Okay, is the client required to sign the contract? That was an earlier question. I can answer that, Steve.
Okay.
So the NAC regulation requires that you provide a written contract. And Steve will back me up on this, many of our complaints start there because there was no written contract. The client thinks that you promised X and didn't deliver Y, and a written contract will prevent most of those complaints. And the written contract has to include a completion date, estimated completion date, terms, and all of that. Whether or not you choose to have the client sign it, that's really kind of a business decision, but it's not going to be legally binding if you don't have them sign it. And I for one, wouldn't proceed with work until I had the client sign it. Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
I would agree. It would need to be signed by both parties to make it official.
Mm-hmm. Note on the flag code, it has no provision for punishment and it is routinely broken, especially in the civilian use. So,
Yes, that is correct.
okay.
Good point. That was one that's not been brought up by anybody before. And I've had this in here for about 8 years now.
Will this webinar serve for Texas as well? Yes, and vice versa. So I had somebody ask yesterday, will an ethics presentation in New York or New Jersey or Montana count towards Nevada? And the answer is yes. The ethics is not specific to Nevada. It's a general ethics presentation. The Nevada requirement is that you have 2 hours of ethics every 2-year renewal period. I think Steve covered that earlier in the presentation, but,
Yes.
but yeah, the answer is yes to that. Let's see, Absolutely, thank you. Sorry, just trying to read quickly. Is there concerns over responsible charge in the processing of drone information? I'm not sure what that's specifically referring to. What concerns that Rick is asking this question. Steve, do you?
If he's when we were talking about responsible charge, it was only addressing if the drone was being used for land surveying.
Okay.
And I would think that if it's processing of information, it would be processing of the recordings the drone took with regards to land surveying. So yes, I would say that you would need a PLS in responsible charge to process that information.
Okay. All right.
If it related to the points that were made that I showed on the screens about overlays and things of that nature.
Okay. I think there was some comments going back and forth. I think there were some people that had some information on that, responded with that. But and if that's the case, maybe we can roll through that. Anyway, the questions are continuing to roll in, so let me get through this, and then we can go back and maybe hit some of these that weren't covered. Is there a limit to how many locations a PLS can be responsible in responsible charge over? I'm thinking that might mean how many states a PLS can be responsible charge over.
No, I think they were talking about brick and mortar buildings. You know, how many physical locations can a PE be in responsible charge of?
Or PLS?
Or PLS, yes. And there was no number given in the code. So I would say unlimited, but we'll check on that to be sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. List of data. I think for Texas, 1 hour must be specific to Texas. I'm wondering if that's Edward Robinson. That was his comment. I think that's ethics. 1 hour of Steve, you live in Texas. What do you know what that one refers to?
I would have to look up the code. I believe it just says 1 hour in ethics.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it says specific to Texas ethics, but that could be implied.
Okay. I think, yeah, there's some response coming.
Oh, Derek, because I do a different one for every state that I present ethics in.
Mm-hmm.
I presented in Louisiana, Maryland, Indiana, New Mexico, Nevada, and Texas.
Okay.
And every one where I talked about the NAC and NRS codes, I would talk about the Texas codes or the New Mexico codes in that portion of the presentation.
Okay. So if somebody got 1 hour of ethics in, let's say, New Mexico, that would count in Texas. Is that correct? As for ethics?
I would have, that now brings up that question like he asked. Is it a test? Does the code say you must have 1 hour in Texas ethics, meaning the Texas code is the way I would interpret that.
Okay.
I would have to find out.
Okay.
That's a good question.
You stumped the presenter. Good job.
I get stumped all the time.
Okay. That is the last, let's see, did I get to the bottom of the questions here?
Oh.
let me quickly scroll to the very top and try to catch some of the questions that we got at the very beginning. What is the email address I request for this PDF certificate form? Steve, can you go back up to the previous slide? And that's going to have my email on it. I will tell you all, my email is also on the website. If you go to nvbpels.org and go under the board link, you'll see the staff link under there, and my email is also there. So if you don't capture it here, it's dvogel@boe.state.nb.us. My name is Derek. Feel free to shoot me that request, and I'll send you the certificate. Let's see. A lot of people, when Steve was asking questions, I had lots of people responding with their guesses on the numbers.
We should have had you read out a couple of those.
Well, they were coming in so fast I couldn't.
Yeah, I know. That's very, when we have over 500 people, because we did max out on the number of people attending.
We did.
It's kind of hard to follow all of them.
Yes, and I'm sure we're getting phone calls as we speak with people who are unable to join. And for those of you, for whatever reason, that had difficulties with this, that want to review the chat questions, things like that, I'm going to put this link to a video, a YouTube video up. It'll be on our website later on today, and then you can go back through and you'll be able to see the chat questions and review it for those purposes. So I'll have that up later. Is Illinois the only state that requires 1 hour of sexual harassment training to renew a PE license? I don't know specifically about Illinois. Nevada, we have during your renewal, license renewal, we have a disclaimer that was, I think, fairly recently added that it's a disclosure that have you been, and I think it's child or sexual harassment. Anyway, there's a disclosure that you have to do for the license renewal, but I don't think it requires training in Nevada. I don't know about Illinois. Steve, can you speak to that?
No, I didn't even know that was a thing. I'm going to look it up for Illinois. I've never presented in that state, and I've never really reviewed their code. I know that a lot of states require have a statement about child support, that if you're in arrears, you can't be relicensed or renew your license.
Yeah. This one is an interesting question. You quote polls, and I think this was back in the section where you were
right.
Gallup polls and things like that. You quote polls, but isn't part of ethics doing the right thing regardless of what others may think? To me, I've used this example in a previous life, previous profession, but integrity is doing the right thing when nobody's looking. Regardless of whether you're being watched or not, you always do the right thing. So it's kind of along the same lines. But isn't the part of ethics doing the right thing regardless of what others think?
That is true. Yes. Okay. Yes, I agree with that. In fact, that's the key point, key part of ethics, the way I look at it.
Yeah. Does teaching PE review course to a forum like ASCE, YMF, voluntary count towards Pdh? And the answer is, Steve, unless I'm missing something, it's absolutely yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's a 1-to-1 for that 1 hour contact hour. Yeah. On the cheating example, I think that was one of the case studies, Steve. On the cheating example, wouldn't professional be acting on hearsay if she proceeds independently? I'm not sure. Do you know what that is referring to?
I think what that was referring to would be if the engineer that the student came to, or the professor the student came to and said, I saw cheating in Professor B's class, that is what they're asking about, is hearsay evidence, because engineer A did not actually see the photos on the phone or see what the student was doing. So he was just using what somebody else was claiming. It might be considered hearsay, but the Board of Ethical Review, I should say, ruled that it was probably serious enough that he should take it further if he didn't feel appropriate action was taken. Because you don't know what Professor B was going to say to him or anything like that.
Okay. All right. I'm just going to scroll down because we've had a few questions, maybe clarifications come in. This is an interesting one. Can we get all the states to reconcile around a common set of rules? Can we get the states to agree?
If we could do that.
Can we get the states to agree on anything? I think that would be a wonderful world. But the practical reality is, and it's not trying to be trite or get around answering the question, but every state has different statutes and regulations. It would be a big challenge. I think all in all, if you look at some of the commonalities, just in terms of requirements for PE, NCEES does a pretty good job of that's taken a lot of the burden off the individual states by, providing the testing and records keeping and all of that. So there are, for what it's worth, that a lot of that has become a lot easier over the last, 10 years, especially. But I don't know that there's going to be ever a point where all the states agree 100% on everything. Does Nevada Water Resources Association membership qualify as 2 Pdh credits? Membership association. I don't think membership in a professional association counts as Pdh credit, right, Steve?
Just so happens I have the code printed out right here. The actual wording. I think some of the activities within those organizations would count, attending technical workshops and things like that. Those absolutely count. What it says is, for Pdh credit, serving as an officer or participating member of a committee of a professional or technical organization. Yeah. So you have to be an active member of a committee within the water resources. Yeah. Department. Okay. Or agency. Okay. So it says serving as an officer or participating member of a committee of a professional or technical organization. Okay. 2 for each calendar year of service. Okay. And just on that point, the list of things that qualify, you can look at them. There's a couple places on our website that I'll point you to that are easy. The statutes and regs, obviously. It's if I remember right, is it 625.510, Steve? It's 625 470. 470. That has a list of the things that qualify and how much you get. The other convenient place to look is if you go on our website, underneath the engineers and land surveyors link, the first link at the top of the page, and go down to forms. You're going to see a link to forms, and then you're going to get to a page that has a Pdh reporting form. On that form, there's a table at the bottom that has a list of all of the things that qualify for Pdh credit and how much you get. So those are the 2 places I would point you to. This is an answer to the Illinois question. Illinois requires it for all professional licenses. I think that was that earlier question about does Illinois, right. Yeah. So this Edward Robinson is saying, I assume that's for all PEs and PLSs. Illinois, and then Robert below that, Illinois requires a harassment training, took already this year. So, okay, there you go. So they do require an hour of harassment training to maintain your PE. Interesting. Yes.
So we've got another question here. Is it possible to get the ethics class I had to miss yesterday due to conflict? Yes. That's Santana or Santana. Sorry, I'm having a hard time reading the name. Yes, it is possible to get that video. And again, the link to this webinar, as well as the one yesterday for Nevada law, are available on our website. If you go to our website on Engineers and Land Surveyors at the top, and then go down to continuing education, I will post both links on that page. Okay, so this one is, if an agreement is required and specific requirements are listed, shouldn't the legal requirements, in parentheses, offer, acceptance, meeting of the minds, consideration, capacity, et cetera, be included in what as well? Also, at least one association offers a model agreement that is extremely skewed against the client. Please comment about the ethics. Steve?
So the contract is skewed against the client.
Which, yeah.
I would say it would be up to the engineers. It would be the engineer's decision to whether to use that or not. If he or she felt that it wasn't right, that's the whole basics for ethics, is doing the right thing. Then they should either modify it or make use of their own form, unless, or is it saying that one's the only form that could be used?
At least one association. It doesn't. I don't think it specifies. That's Grant Lauder's comment. Grant, if you want to clarify, feel free to shoot a chat. I'm going to move on to the next one. Does a purchase order count as a contract? Steve, maybe that gets into the technicality of it, but as long as the purchase order covers the completion, the scope of work, it includes the completion date, and it's able to be signed. I mean, purchase orders, I've seen all different kinds. Some are signed, some are not.
And I've seen them that covers all aspects of what's required by the code, except and then there's also usually a place for comments or notes, and you can mention the liability insurance down there.
So I guess so the answer to that question is, as long as it includes the provisions of 625.545, the scope of work, the cost of completion of the work, and the anticipated timeline and date of completion.
Right. And signed by both seller and purchaser, or engineer and purchaser, that would, yes.
Yeah. Do PDHs expire? If I attend a seminar and it earned 15 PDHs in 2019, can I use toward renewing my license in 2022? No,
they must be obtained in the years prior to the of the biennial renewal. Yeah. So you get 2 years, and it's 30 hours every 2 years. And this is the thing that kind of throws a lot of people off. Like, that, when does the clock start ticking? Well, when you renew your license, you've accumulated 30 hours of PDH credit at the point when you renew. That clock starts ticking on the next 30 hours that you have to accumulate the date that you renew. So for the next 2 years, you've got to accumulate those as you go. And we do that so that you ideally are learning and increasing your knowledge as you progress. I also assume that news and events calendar also shows PDH worthy organizations. Yes, it does. I assume you're talking about our website, Grant. Yes, it does. I got my license in January 2020. My first renewal is next month due. In that case, PDH is earned during the 2020 and June 2020 can be counted for renewal or not. Well, the good news is for you, if you were licensed in January 2020 and you're renewing, now you're exempt. You get your first renewal, you are exempt from reporting your 30 PDH hours. So, but as I just said, and when the clock starts ticking on your next
biennial renewal period, you should start earning those PDH credits as you go along. So you'll renew again in 2024, I think. Yeah, anyway, is a standard of care required in a contract? Steve, is that
Standard of care?
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that.
Not sure, but I would have to say no, because the requirements are just scope of work,
Yeah.
Cost, and timeline or completion date.
Right. I'm not sure if standard of care is part of.
I would say no.
Yeah. Okay. PDH must be attained during the license period, but some carryover hours up to 15 from previous are allowed if you had extra. That is 100% correct, Jim. Thank you for that. So what Jim is saying is, if you, let's say for a renewal period, you earned 45 credit hours, you're only required to earn 30. 15, a maximum of 15 would be allowed to carry over to the next renewal period. And on your license renewal form, there's a box that allows you to carry those over. You check that box. Please remove, Steve, can you go back a screen to, or the forward screen to the certificate so people can see that? There you go. And again, if anybody has difficulty getting this, I will send me an email and I'll shoot you a PDF. So you submit 40 credits, you could roll over 10 credits towards next renewal, correct? Yes, Robert, that's correct. If you have 40 PDH, you can carry 10 into renewal. Jim, law requirement cannot be carried over. That's correct. So the 1 hour of Nevada law and the 2 hours of ethics cannot be carried over. Those, you're required to earn those for each renewal period, each 2-year renewal period. Okay. From Texas requirements, every license holder is required to obtain 15 PDH units during the renewal period. A minimum of 1 PDH per renewal period must be in the area of professional ethics, roles, and responsibilities of professional engineering, or review of the Texas Engineering Practice Act and the board rules. PDH units carried forward may not be counted to meet the professional ethics requirement. Thank you, Lee, for that. I think that's copied and pasted. Is there a way to find out how many carryover hours I had during my last renewal? Absolutely. In Nevada, we can look that up for you and pull up the database and do that for you. So Kaylee, that was your question. Give me a call or shoot me an email later and I can, if you need to know what that information is, I can look it up for you. Could the person who is up for his first renewal put down hours that he earned and carry over the 15 of them? And I guess that's a good technical question. You're exempt from the renewal period, but are you allowed to carry them over for the next one? That's
but they were earned after you retained your license, correct?
Correct. Yeah, no, it's the first renewal period. So you're exempt from
they were retained during that. I would say you could, I would think.
Yeah, I can't see any reason why not.
Yeah.
Does training towards project management count for PDHs? Steve, you want to hit that one? Because project management it depends on what kind of project management, as long as it's engineering or land surveyor related.
I would say so.
Yeah, but I think it's got to be specific. It can't be, business project management. It's got to be something related to the.
It has to be technical in nature.
Right.
Yeah, I would think it would count.
Okay. Would you consider it to be unethical for Nevada State Public Works to require a structural engineer to include recommendations generated by a licensed geotechnical engineer on the structural contract documents, despite the fact that the geotechnical recommendations are beyond the structural engineer's area of expertise? Note that the geotechnical report is not considered to be part of the project contract documents in this case. John Zielinski, that's probably a more complicated answer than I think that there's kind of some caveats, exceptions. That's a good question. I think I'd want to talk that over with Murray because I think there's a couple areas in there that it gets into discipline specific. I mean, I think what you're getting around or the point you're getting to is that are you allowed to practice, approve things that are outside your area of your discipline, civils approving geotechnical or mechanical or electrical and things like that. So that's one aspect of your question, but specifically to the geotechnical, I'd want to have a conversation. So John, if you don't mind, shoot me an email on that and I'd be happy to follow up on that. Okay. Does anybody else have any more questions? Have we, I think I've gotten to all of them, which is good. But if anybody has any others, please feel free to, we've got a few minutes before this ends. So feel free to shoot another chat if you've got questions. We'll give folks a couple minutes, and then if not, I will thank everyone for attending. If again, you've got my email, you've got the website. If you think of anything that you need clarification on, feel free to shoot me an email. Steve, you want to?
Yeah, same thing. I guess, yep. We had another good session of questions. Thank you very much. It was good input. I always learned something from them. And I guess we can call it quits now, Derek.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to close them, stop the recording and end it again. Hit me with an email if you've got questions beyond that. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.